So welcome to room 221. We have Sage Orville with us and speaking about how the foundations of UX can bring resumes into the 21st century. So thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for having me. All right, so I'm going to kind of talk about the history of resumes for a little bit, talk about how the user experience from the hiring process and from those submitting has shifted and changed over time, and then kind of talk about the best tips and tricks we can utilize now that the landscape of job applications is changing. Unfortunately, I did not update for how the landscape of job applications is changing now that everyone's gone remote and that the coronavirus is spreading. I unfortunately am not that up to date for those real-time updates, but we'll get up until at least what life was like 2 weeks ago, and hopefully these tips and tricks become useful again very soon. And at the end, we'll have some time for questions. So if you can hold off until then, that's great. If not, I can try to pop my chat up and keep an eye on things as it goes through. At the very end, you're also welcome to unmute yourselves and ask, so you're hearing more than just my own voice. Because I too have been trapped inside and would love some human contact here. So we're gonna start with the history. As early as the late 1400s is when we start to see the first professional resume. That was from Leonardo da Vinci. Whew, sorry, it has been a long day and not enough caffeine. He actually wrote everything as paragraphs, kind of talking about his experience and the history of work. Moving through, several centuries later, we start to get it to be common enough that people are recommending them within business books. Continuing onward, starting to hit the Great Depression and then all the way through the 1960s, resumes are institutionalized. They're what used to be these little scraps of paper that kind of just jotted down what it was that you used to do and your past experience. They're now expected. If we think about at that time that they're emerging, we don't have the widespread use of computers yet. A lot is being handwritten. While there are printing presses, you're probably not using them for your resumes. You can also, typewriters, things like that, all to say that it's a very arduous process at that time, that the job seekers are having to write it out by hand. The method of looking for jobs too was also relying heavily on newspaper and print media, word of mouth, things like that, as opposed to now where you can suddenly Google and find, 40, 50 jobs in your field within a single search. That's becoming like largely modernized through websites like Indeed. So back in the day, the sheer amount of volume that you had was significantly less. It became a lot more difficult to search for jobs, especially ones that were out of your immediate geographical region. So that's, about 60 years ago, drastically different landscape for job seekers. We start to see more pushes and a formalization of the layout and standards that we expect for resumes. So in the 1980s, Microsoft Word launches, and it includes a template for resumes, that kind of standard layout and form that we're so used to seeing now. I mean, some things have shifted. We've seen kind of the emergence and the removal of fields like objective at the top. Those are things that I highly push for, but and we'll talk about that more later, but we're at least starting to see a start of formalization for job seekers. Here's a quote from Da Vinci and what one of the lines on his resume looks like. As you can tell, it was very, very long, not particularly skim friendly, but also the sheer volume people had to engage with was drastically different. Milo, sorry if my dog is growling at my housemates as they get ready for the morning. So all to say, things have shifted a lot. If you received a resume that looked like this today, I would probably throw it out immediately. That is way too much. It definitely mirrors more of a cover letter than it does a resume. So some of the language that I want to highlight, resumes in its purest form, I believe originating from French language, what used to refer to just a summary of past events. These are what we're seeing as your standard 1 to 2 pagers. I mean, now they've kind of become 2 pagers for the front, back, single sheet. But they've shifted a lot. Back in the day, they also used to include things like your weight, height, marital status, and religion. Not to say that job discrimination doesn't still exist at very Definitely does. But it made it significantly easier back in the day because you were expected to write all of these things out. I'd also be bereft if in a talk about resumes, I didn't also mention the ample research that shows pretty significant hiring biases based off of names that sound from different ethnic backgrounds versus more Caucasian and Eurocentric names. They're seeing pretty high rates of job discrimination there. They're continuing to see high rates for those who, for even qualified candidates who are marking whether or not they were previously incarcerated. LGBT indicators on jobs, I believe for female applicants who list any sort of queer identifier, their callbacks are about 30% less than those who don't. So if you volunteer with a queer organization or show any sort of GSA or things like that, your chances of getting a job or a callback plummet by about a third, which is pretty disheartening. So I'd be bereft if I didn't mention that just because we're not including all of these things today, like we're still seeing a pretty heavily biased that's just become a lot more covert. Lastly, and a lot of these tips and tricks I'm going to go into also work for your CVs. These are Latin meaning course of life. These are when you're like, what is every single thing you have ever done ever that is slightly related to your professional experience. So every publication, every talk, every symposium. So for example, speaking right now, this will go on my CV. It will not go on my resume. So now we're kind of seeing a shift in delivery, right? So we talked about before how you have to, you used to have to kind of dig through your local geographic region. You were looking for paper adverts. You were maybe calling places, directly seeing if there were positionings. Now there's a huge shift. So Indeed, it's been around a long time, over 15 years, but it wasn't until about 2010, so about a decade ago, that it really started to surpass most of its competitors. Now it is one of the top job seeking places. If anyone's been looking for a job recently, which in light of huge upticks in unemployment right now from the virus, anyone who's been on Indeed recently, you can put in a single keyword and come up with so many jobs. And, at least I'm in Western Mass. We don't even have as robust and as highly saturated an economy as something like New York City. And so the job seeking process is very easy. One of the other things from a user experience too, you can one-click apply. And so it is a long cry from having to type everything out on a typewriter or handwrite it. You can upload your resume, you can fill it out, and then when you see jobs that you want, you literally just one click and it sends it on its way. Maybe you're doing custom cover letters, maybe you're reusing the same one, but the ease and the barrier of access for the user has significantly dropped. We're also seeing formalization of professional social media platforms like LinkedIn. While it was founded also about 20 years ago, it was only until also the rough time period of 2013 that it started to reach 300 million users. By 2016, it reaches 400 million, and it is continuing to grow rapidly. When we start to see this uptick in online applications and a huge uptick in the volume, more and more people are applying, businesses start to use applicant tracking systems. What these do is they start to dig through to find the keywords that people are using and the keywords that you want for your job. So for instance, things like a master's. If people are looking for a certain level of education, it can search for that. If they're looking for people who are capable of having search engine optimization or things like that, if they want to make sure that their candidates know how to code in certain languages, they will be putting in keyword searches. On places like Indeed, they might even ask for you to just select a drop down from the field of how many years experience do you have in this skill set, and then you select your number. And so they're using a lot of this to cull through the sheer amount of applicants that they're getting. And so by 2012, about 90% of businesses are using it. That number continues to grow. And at that time, half of all resumes were thrown out before the employer ever viewed it, which as a job seeker is pretty abysmal, which means we have to play a different game to kind of make it through. So touching on some of those changes in UX, we're seeing an increase in the ease of finding a job. a heavy use of AI that is searching through applicants' resumes. One-click applies, so that barrier of applying, super easy. Skill endorsement. This is something that we're seeing on LinkedIn, that while we still have not gone away with practices of letters of recommendation or references, you have people who are able to vouch for you. You have people who are able to go through and endorse you for specific skills that allows for a stronger networking system, especially within LinkedIn. We're also seeing testing sent to applicants. While typically lower rank positions, which I know can also be arbitrary, as you know, lower rank positions can also be are the very things that are keeping us vital and operating right now, things like grocery stores and gas stations. So it's probably not the best term, but we'll say more entry-level skills positions are heavily using personality testing, for instance. So we're seeing since at least 2012 a huge amount of personality testing to see, are you independent, are you this, are you that, most of which are simply trying to seek correlations and consistencies within answering. Most psychological testing and that kind of testing standards have found that those tests have very poor performance in predicting employee merit and value, yet they're still being heavily used. So we're still seeing the, you know, do you work best in a team or not? And these really rudimentary binaries. And so on that level of job, that is the type of test we're seeing. On skilled professions, we're seeing either the requirement for certifications and verifications with databases that we can track and check. So if you're looking at working trades, so carpenters, electricians, they're asking for your licensing number, they're asking for things like that are very easy to verify. Back in the day, they were not. Now they are. That is all incredibly easy to check. We're now seeing also testing added through things like Indeed. So if I was looking for jobs as a marketer, a lot of the things that it will test me for are how would I keyword things? They're testing for my grammar, they're testing for my language use. And so these are all standardized tests that I go through and I have to take, that they'll then submit an expertise level to the potential employer as a way to automatically start vetting clients. And so we're seeing a greater increase, at least in the barrier of entrance there. That is also shifting how job applications are taken. A lot of these tests are also have strict time periods, which can be a huge accessibility issue, especially for those who are using alternative means of navigating through their computer, those who might have cognitive impairments or things like dyslexia that might make some of these high pressure timed responses very difficult, because most of them you get 30 seconds to a minute to respond for very kind of long paragraphs and words you have to shift and typos you need to find and things like that. So that's not without bias. It also is impacting a significant amount of groups. For instance, trans individuals are having a very difficult time that if they have publications under their birth names, it can be incredibly difficult to shift that, because the internet now lives forever. We all know that if we have been on the hiring end, we are often looking for the social media accounts of the employees that we're hiring. We're looking to see what they're like as a person before they even come in through a lot of these kind of curated social feeds. That blending of personal and professional is becoming very difficult. I mean, even as an employee now, I mean, I have to make sure I'm constantly reflecting my employer in a, you know, favorable light. So I do have to do a certain amount of culling within my own social feeds, but there is a bit of that bleed too that I also wanted to highlight, especially now because it is so much easier to check publications and to potentially out trans clients, which, as you can tell, is a pretty important topic for me with, well, I guess if it's just a screen record. For those who are watching this in the future, I have a shirt that says trans is beautiful. And as you've noted in my first slide, my pronouns are they, them. So it is a near and dear issue for me. But diving back into UX, and thank you for indulging me in my slight digression. In short, there's been an uptick of applications and a decrease in human vetting. On the hiring end, when I have been seeking for candidates, I mean, we've gotten people who are just simply looking for a keyword. We were looking, for instance, for an entry-level database manager for doing a lot of manual typing of content that they were supposed to be vetting new enrollees for our program, doing a lot of entry-level database work. Yet we got a lot of coders who were applying because they were looking for database management for jobs that were more systems heavy, that were more kind of focusing on servers and things like that, because they were quickly searching for keywords and we're going one click apply, one click apply. And so we got a lot of garbage. We got a lot of garbage that the keywords still made their way through. And, you know, in a single day, we, you know, for that position, we would get probably like 50 applicants. And so that's a lot to dig through. So when you're looking at the user experience of the employer, it is not great. I know the stat that people have been floating around is the average employer spends about 6 seconds on a resume, reading each one. I haven't been able to find the source research for that, so it might be a little bit higher, but to say the least, at least from my anecdotal experience, is it's quick. You know, I'll get a stack of 40 and they'll say, all right, give us your top 3 in an hour. It's not a lot of time. So is it making me go through again? All right. So things when we're looking at UX, for those of you who are not from a kind of computer background, UX is referring to the user experience. What makes the user experience better? So looking at the user experience for websites, we hope that it's skim friendly. We want to be able to quickly figure out what we need to know and move on. We're hoping it's rich in keywords, so we know exactly what it is that we're looking for, and we can easily identify those beats. A low cognitive load. So this would be, for example, if I am trying to look through, if I'm reading an article, right? And I don't see title headings, and I'm trying to move through, and it's just long and it's dense, and I'm just trying to answer a question, that's a heavier cognitive load. That's a lot for me to hold on to. Where the use of subheadings, that helps. It breaks it up. It makes it easier to jump through and segment information. That's one example. An example I often use, at least when I'm working with my student workers and teaching them these concepts, is if you look at, for instance, if I want to teach you how to cook something and I say, all right, grab some eggs. And you're like, cool, are we making omelets? I'm like, no, grab some flour. I'm like, great, are we making bread? I'm like, okay, get some chocolate chips. And suddenly now they're starting, as I give more and more, you know, instructions and ingredients, they're really trying to figure out what this is. So they're holding on to all of this information with no context or place to put it. That's a pretty heavy cognitive load, where we can, you know, a good user experience would alleviate it by saying, all right, we're going to make a cake. Start by grabbing all your ingredients, and they move through. And then we go, okay, now start to mix the wet ones. Now start to mix the dry ones, and creating buckets of information that start to break it down into easily digestible places that people know how to sort that. Your resume should be doing the same thing. And while there's a certain amount of labeling that we have with work experience, you know, education, things like that, we can do a lot to split it out quite a bit more. You know, I think one of the industry, you know, best intro books to experience, the book Don't Make Me Think by Steve Krug. We like to think that what we're submitting for almost anything, whether it's a website or a resume, that is great literature, but the reality of the user is that it's more like driving by a billboard at 60 miles an hour. And I think that is so much more painfully true with our resumes. There's a really great infographic that kind of looks at how people move through. We designed for the idea that we think they're just reading through line by line. So for instance, people will make very, very dense, heavily worded bullet points on their resume. But the reality is that people are just quickly jumping for something that looks vaguely applicable. And it looks like it's resembling what they're talking about. So what should you do for your resume? You need to cull. You need to ask each line, does it add value? A practice I like to do, kind of rooted in that old history of when people were taking out ads in the newspaper and you have to pay per word. If you had to pay for every word on your resume, what would it say? I bet it'd be a lot shorter. You know, even when I'm working with web clients and they're just writing way, way too much because we're so used to that endless scroll and the ability to have that space, the endless advance of space that digital realms often leave us, because, you know, people say, oh, this is a little long. Why don't we just make it size 10? Why don't we just make it size 9? And you end up with this, you know, we'll just make the margins a half inch. Don't do that. It really helps if you give yourself, you know, like an index card and say, okay, I need to, right now, my job experience is so long, I need to force it all into an index card, and then you type it. You really should do the practice of physically restricting your content. That helps a lot. And then lastly, are you burying the lead? Oftentimes, people are not tailoring their resumes to the skill sets that employers are looking for. They'll write the biggest chunk of their job, which is good. I mean, it's if the majority of your job is one thing, you don't want to mislead that by putting something else first. But as you start to get to those kind of secondary and tertiary tasks that are part of your job, people don't arrange that order smartly or strategically. They really end up burying the part of their job that is a flashy or important skill that's needed for the places that they're applying for. You know, there's certain things that we're expected to do. You know, a foundation of UX is that the news should feel familiar, that we should be keeping things consistent. A problem that I see a lot of times when people fresh out of college are applying, students love to put their education first. And it's not that I don't care, but you know, there is a convention of putting your work experience before that. There is a convention of knowing where things are clear and having clear titles, headers, and that the user isn't left with these questions. So kind of getting into the nitty gritty, there's a few things that you can start to call. So I start with the exact address. It is a convention that I don't think has been updated in a very long time. Does it add any value for me to tell you exactly where I live? Does my house number add value? Does my street number add value? Because let's talk about that user experience. Either you live in the area, and that's fantastic, or maybe you live kind of far away and we're left questioning, will you commute that far? So I can't tell you how many applications as an employer we have thrown away because we go, that's like an hour commute. Are they going to relocate? Do you think they're actually going to show up every day? Because the question isn't only, can they do this job? But it's also like, will they stay? A lot of these jobs are skilled. It takes a long time to onboard people, especially when you need to communicate a lot of institutional value. And if you don't think the person's going to stay, you might end up favoring the, you know, the equally qualified or maybe even slightly less qualified person who lives 5 minutes up the road. So it's not to say that you shouldn't put where you live, but one, your direct address does not add any value that I find relevant. You know, I live in Holyoke. It doesn't make a difference if I live in the Highlands or the Flats or, you know, anywhere else. That if I'm on Pleasant or Main Street, does it make a difference if I, you know, or Lincoln or whatever, any of these streets around here, does that add any value? No. Saying I live in Holyoke might, then I can include it. If it is a job that you live far from, it might be worth putting like in parentheses, willing to relocate. Because otherwise the user might be left questioning, well, are they planning to move? I don't know. Maybe we should just throw it out. I don't think they're going to end up. Sorry, my dog has a lot of thoughts. Milo. Sorry about that, everybody. So mark those things if you're willing to relocate. Okay, so objective. After my name, my contact information, I always lead with an objective. And why? It's essentially answering, are they a good fit and will they stay? So objectives I use to put my professional goals, the type of work that I want to be doing, the type of business I want to do it for, and maybe the type of environment. So oftentimes, you know, I'll write something along the lines of looking to provide, you know, marketing analytics support for a collaborative, fast-paced environment in a nonprofit or higher ed setting, you know, something like that. Because otherwise it can be difficult. Objectives are also really important if you're making a career shift or you're changing the vocation that you're looking at. So for instance, you know, back with the same database management position, we had someone who owned a car salesman lot. He was selling used cars. He inherited it from his father. So we're looking through and like, yes, he had database experience from tracking all this inventory, but we're like, well, he also, you know, this is a really quiet job. Like we all sit in our little windowless cubes and type all day. Does he actually want this? We feel like this guy might be more social. I don't think he's a good fit. And it wasn't until he hit the cover letter that he was saying he inherited the job from, he inherited the business from his father when his father passed. He's been trying to maintain it, but he wants something more stable. He wants something predictable. He really doesn't like selling the cars and wants something more stable so he could provide for his family. That he's enjoyed the database aspect and he'd like to continue that. And now we're like, oh, this candidate is awesome. Like, okay, this is who we want. But if he had just put that in his objective, I mean, because I mean, we luckily were reading through enough that, you know, a lot of people will read the resume first, and if it looks good, then they'll read the cover letter. But that meant the entire time we were reading his resume, we thought he was a bad fit. Any information he was telling us had no context for us to actually vet it with. All he needed was a 1 or 2 sentence objective to say, you know, currently looking to switch vocation into something more quiet in a consistent environment with, you know, routine or schedule or anything like that. And we would have been like, awesome, this guy is great. I think we should pull him in for an interview. So those things are really, really helpful, especially if you're making a career shift, or especially if what you're looking for mirrors what the workplace is offering. You can mention work styles. You know, I also do a significant amount of wedding photography. I do a heavy amount of event coverage. And so oftentimes if I was seeking an exclusive photography position, I would list that I do a lot of documentary style candid work, which is helpful for people who want that, who go, hell yeah, if they're a college and they're looking for someone to document student events, they'll be like, that's great, versus a person who says they're doing studio work. That it's okay to alienate some places that won't be a good fit, especially if you know in your heart, you're like, I don't want to do studio work. I don't want to do this. That's not really my thing. If it's product photography or something like that, you can mention your work styles, especially because for the people who that fits with and the jobs that they jive with, you're going to be a hard yes. They're going to say, bring this person in. And some other examples here. And I know I'm pulling mostly from my own experience, but I think a lot of us as creatives tuning in here can very easily tailor this. For you coders, you can mention if you do agile, you know, launches or not, that those sort of things are really helpful in signaling your skill set. So there's a few things you shouldn't do, and one is leave it blank. I really think that one sentence goes a very far way. Essentially, this is with my analogy before, the analogy of making a cake. This is we're making a cake. You're saying, this is what I want to do, and now we have a context for where you're trying to move that provides a context for all of this information to make sense. And then they can see and read your narrative as they go through. But also don't make it too granular or make it sound like you copy and paste of the job description, because people can smell out bullshit incredibly quickly. So for example, I used to work at a Jewish nonprofit that gave out free books to kids every month. We were sending out like $250,000 monthly. It was a pretty large enterprise, or I guess is, I'm just no longer there. So if I was applying for a content marketing position there and I wrote my objective is to write blog posts about books at a Jewish nonprofit, that is so weirdly specific. I'd be like, all right, yeah, I don't think so. That's not many people's jam. But what you could do is say to advance the goals of a religious organization through content marketing in a fast-paced, mission-driven organization. So that could be really, really great. If maybe you have a background doing, if you're Jewish and you've done a lot of like religious work, but maybe not marketing work, then you can even just say, then you can get granular on that aspect. But, you know, writing blog posts about Jewish books at a nonprofit, especially if you specify for kids, like that is so weirdly specific. There were very few people who are like, yes, this is what I want to do with my life. That if you write that on your resume, I'm going to not believe it. So you want it to be believable. You want it to be real. You know, there are certain institutions or things that will align with you. So currently I'm working with Mount Holyoke College. And so I could say if I'm working, that I either want to work in higher ed, or I can specify that I want to work in an environment geared at mitigating the impacts of sexism and gender bias, that any of those things can really work. But if I'm like, I would love to work in a South Hadley based college, and very strange. So keep it broad, keep it real, and it will make you seem like a very good culture fit. And we'll kind of answer the question of, will they stay? Do they actually want to work here? Because that turnover is a very real and looming threat that employers want to try to avoid. So let's get into work experience. A lot of best practices that people recommend are saying, you effectively did this, you efficiently did that, you did this with high efficacy. I sure hope you did, because if you didn't, I don't want to hear about it on your resume. Like, those are filler words that are not adding any value. You're making a really, really long line that doesn't need to be there, you know? it kind of falls into that same idea of, if you had to pay for every word, would that word be there? Probably not. You know, if you are doing marketing, you're doing email segmentation, right? For like based on user demographics or something like that. You could just say, you know, emailed user list, or did a lot of segmentation work. You don't need to say all the specific ways unless it's a unique and novel skill. So if it was based off of live actions and responses, if it was behavioral based segmentation, great. But odds are you don't need all of that extra stuff. And I know so many, you know, top 5 things you should do for your resume sites are telling you to add in a lot of these words, and you really shouldn't. I don't want to hear if you're punctual. I'm sure hoping you are by the time you're looking for professional careers. It's just wasting space. A lot are telling you to put tangible numbers behind everything, and sure, that could be helpful to show scale, but people are getting really granular and specific in a way that's not helpful. So if it's you know, managing a team of, you know, I managed a team of 15 full-time employees and 8 part-timers. I mean, that's a little weird. So you can, you know what, it's adding a lot of words on a lot of cognitive load that if someone is skimming through, think about if they're skimming through and you've got 5 line items on under that work experience and they only read 2. Is that the 2 you want them to read? If they really rested on that sentence, do you think that's telling your narrative well? Probably not. You can put supervised a team of 20, about 20. It's a lot shorter, it's a lot briefer, there's very limited cognitive load, and that way someone can actually get to a lot more bullet points and really get to what they're looking for without being bogged down by the visual and rhetorical load that's being cluttered throughout. Actually, make sure it actually represents what you did. And I know this sounds not, you know, it's common sense, yet, you know, I was working with a front desk support at a local web design company. They started to integrate him as a junior designer. When he started applying for things, he was only putting his code-based experience. While that's important, what he failed to do was to show any of the, you know, project management stuff he had gotten pulled in on as kind of an assistant, any of the secretarial skills, and it was really hurting him in job applications. So I helped him go through and redo it, because a lot of those, you know, soft skills are really quite vital. That ability, I mean, how many awkward coders do you know who cannot talk to people at all? Like, it is good to know when you have front end support, and you don't need to, you know, if you have 5 positions that are doing that, you don't need to hammer it home in all 5. You can hammer it home in 1 or 2, and then let the other, you know, the variety and the nuance in each new position really shine through. And so that is incredibly, incredibly helpful here. And when they ended up calling me as a reference, they said, we want someone who can actually talk to clients. What is his client interactions like? And all of his questions were about that and not about the code. So it was to his great benefit to include that. Mentioning specific programs you use. So if you're coding in specific languages, if you are using specific database management software, if you are using different CRMs like Salesforce versus Constant Contact versus MailChimp, those are all really helpful. If it's a niche program, it helps to briefly describe it. So if I've worked with Microsoft Dynamics, a lot of people don't know what that is. So I'll say, you know, cleaned databases for Microsoft Dynamics, comma, a relational database. Because it pulled in a lot of relational tables, and suddenly now it has context to actually add value. So people who aren't familiar with the software but maybe use a similar one know that I have adjacent experience. If you mentioned a skill previously, as I've said, you don't need to go that far in depth. You can just, you know, if you have somewhere on your resume a lot of those soft skills, for instance, or if you have somewhere on your resume a lot of one type of thing, you don't need to like kill time making that line item apparent in every single one in as much detail as before. And keep it short. I don't want to see 15 bullets under anything. Keep it 3 to 7. And if it's an odd job, an introductory sentence helps. So my work at the Harold Grinspoon Foundation, that was a Jewish nonprofit. A lot of the database work we were doing was based off of that monthly subscription pattern. So it was a lot of you know, day-to-day processing, but then we had end of month culminations and pretty big data outputs to get those mailing lists. And so without that context, it was super confusing for a reader to move through, because they're like, wait, what are you doing? What type of databases are you working with? And so I have one sentence that just says what the org does, and now there's a context for what that looks like. So here's the example. And so this is what I literally put: a Jewish nonprofit that gives away free children's books on a monthly basis. Now all that database work that I'm doing makes sense of why I'm doing it and why I have those line items. And so it's not confusing. Another thing that you can do is, if you have, we all know that we start to get better jobs, things that are more relevant. These things are eventually going to get kicked off of mine. But for a while, if you have, let's say you have things that are a good networking experience, right? You have some sort of, like, maybe you were a secretary or, some sort of support staff at higher ed. Oftentimes higher ed only likes to hire other higher ed people. It might be worth making it super tiny in the bottom of those other positions that you do. Or you've been working for 30 years and you're like, well, I can't fit all of it on 2 pages, but some of the things you've spent 6 or 7 years in. Great, put it in the bottom corner on that 2-column thing, keep it small. You can say that you've done it, but really then you can focus on your most recent and relevant experience. You don't have to lose it all, but you do want to make it less of a highlight. Here's another example, that coder that I mentioned. He had coded out some games, and when he was talking about the software that he used and the different languages, I'm like, okay, that's great, but I literally have no idea what this game is. You're not adding outlinks to your GitHub for each game, so tell me what it is. And so we went through and we actually added those lines to create context for what it was that he was talking about, and it helped a lot. Another thing, skills versus software. And I am being conscious of time, so I'm sorry, might not have a ton of time for questions at the end, so I'll try to keep it moving. Separate these out. I can't tell you how many people just put a big blob paragraph of everything. Skills, they're what you do. Those are the tangible skills that you're bringing to the table, and the software is what you do it with. Separate these out and make them into groups of like materials. You can even add, you can sort by type as shown here, research programs, database management, if you're doing web builders, coding, or whatever field you're working in. You can add a proficiency ranking if you want, how many out of 5 stars. That can really help for people gauging what you're doing. And you don't want to only do your 4 and 5 stars, because then I'm going to be suspicious. I'm like, okay, you're 5 stars on everything. I don't believe that. It's okay to show that some of them you don't. That doesn't mean you should then overcompensate by making all your 2-star things, but add some humility. It really adds a value of transparency and honesty that really does a lot in kind of getting that buy-in of truth. Once again, no one cares if you're punctual or detail-oriented. The type of work you do will show if you're detail-oriented or if you're a big picture person. Keep it industry-specific if you want. Okay, moving through here. Formatting. Headers. Please use headers. The benefits. It will upload better. Software reads it. So, you see most of the times when you submit documents, you don't know if it's going to get pulled apart and formatted into all the same text, all the same pre-populated fields, or if they're actually going to get it as a PDF. It's not always clear from the user end what's going to happen with that. So sometimes I use plain text ones if it's clear that it's going to go through that and you have the chance to edit, but sometimes they don't say. So those header tags will make it upload significantly easier. It makes it easier to style. If you decide to change a font later, it will go through and update all of those in one go. It makes less style errors and inconsistencies. So if you remember to make everything, all your headers 18 and one of them still size 20, this would help alleviate that problem. And so even within Google Docs, when you go through and you select your title, your header, 1, 2, 3, you can also update them to match whatever new style you're doing. So don't feel like you're limited to what the defaults are. Limit your fonts. I am not a proponent of keeping it all one font, all one color. Visuals are important. They're not frivolous. They allow to better visually segment and jump through your application if it isn't one of the ones that's being destroyed in formatting. And even if the application you submit has that happening to it and it's going into one homogeneous look, if you get an in-person interview, please bring a formatted resume so that way people can actually look through and digest it. Make it skim-friendly. Do not burden the user. Limit the amount of colors though. I don't want to see 20 colors in your resumes. And use those bright colors sparingly. Those can, like your main text paragraphs, keep those black or, dark gray, something neutral. Have a clear visual hierarchy and make sure there's big spacing. Also left align. I've seen some people submitting some things that are centered. That becomes really difficult. And I'll show you some examples why. And the reason that you need to have that hierarchy is because not everything is important. You can't fail to make the decisions that are tough about what is vital, and really making sure those segmented pieces are clear is great. I'm going to skip over this section for the sake of time, but I'm happy to chat with people more about it after. And the 1 versus 2 column layouts. 2 columns upload a little worse, but they create less labor for the eye of tracking all the way to the end and back. And it really helps you have a deprioritized column of like those softer things that are kind of tertiary or secondary cares. Make sure you're always using bullets, that you're not just putting like dash, space, 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 blah, blah, blah. This makes it a lot more accessible for those using screen readers and will also format better when you're uploading. Clear visual chunks, left align. Okay, so here's an example of someone who did not do that. They inserted little bullets, everything. You can see everything is on a clear line that they didn't tab in, which means as I read through, it's really hard for my eye to jump. Everything is the same size text with very little visual hierarchy. It is incredibly difficult to read. And so as a user, it is hard as an employer for me to digest this. Here's an example of where your eye is starting when you're doing left aligned versus centered. You can see how easy it is for me to know where to start, and those eye jumps as I move through, especially now when the text is spanning almost an entire page and maybe breaking onto another line where you have huge, huge differences as you're moving through. And don't center your headers. It's the same thing. Keep everything left aligned. Here's an example of a resume that I redid, and kind of breaking into this now, I'll go into a few visual examples here. This is how it looked before on the left here. That was just really, really difficult. A lot of those same errors that we're seeing. And these gray boxes, those are just removing contact information. But we removed out all of those extraneous details that we didn't need. We really simplified it down. I mean, you see the skills and abilities here is what I'm talking about too, that he's really blurring a lot of these things together in a way that makes it hard for me to see. If I'm trying to say, does this guy know this certain software? I have to like read through this whole thing, and it's very time consuming, and I'm more likely to skip over it. And now we made a really clean, clear visual hierarchical thing to look through. You know, I have another one here. I mean, and don't be afraid of using space. You can take up 2 pages. You can do front and back. That's fine. More than that should really be on a CV, but break it up, make it easier to digest. You know, some other formatting styles where you have it highlighted on the side, that once again is a lot easier to jump and move through. And then lastly, I'll end with some tips and tricks here. Keep a plain text version that you use for uploading. You know, sometimes these 2 columns that we're seeing here, sometimes the software will read all the way across. And so it will say experience, skills, gravity switch, full stack developer, thorough smoke testing throughout website. Like it will go all the way across. So sometimes it's good to have a plain text version when you're applying for things that you know will kind of pull it apart and pre-format it. Save with clean file names. This is another thing on the user experience. So the difference of if I have someone's downloading my resume, my cover letter, my CV, maybe a portfolio that it says Sage Shea resume, Sage Shea CV, now all those files are very cleanly sorted and all my content is listed within one place. I don't want to see resume, V2, updated, you know, whatever. Keep it clean and make sure your name's in it too, because the amount of times I've had people apply for things and the file name's just resume, I'm like, the amount I start to download all these people's things and I now have to try to pair them, the candidates back together and sort it all. It's a mess. Don't do that. Send it as a PDF so your formatting doesn't get all screwy. Keep your LinkedIn up to date. You can hyperlink that, which also make sure your links are clean. You can customize your LinkedIn link. So that way it's not just /Sage 9783. Like you can clean that up. So clean it. Keep a CV to archive everything that you've been doing. While you can custom tailor your resumes, you really want to keep that CV as your archival list that shows all of it. UTM codes. If you want to be a little sneaky here, UTM codes are things that you can, custom identifiers that you can add to the end of a link. So let's say I'm applying for a few jobs and want to see who's actually clicking through. You know, like I have a page on my website that shows my portfolio. I have, you know, as someone who works with visual media, I also have, you know, a professional Facebook and Instagram, my website, things like that. If I want to see who's looking at it and where those referrals are coming from, sometimes I'll add an identifier that will say the job name or job title, or even just say that it's a job. So when I go back into my Google Analytics later to see who's gone to my website, I can be like, oh, look, Smith College viewed my resume and a few of them clicked through, and now I know what sections they've actually been looking at as I navigate through my website. That's a little sneaky trick if you have a website and if you're doing Google Analytics. Add some UTM codes when you hyperlink those things, and that way you can actually track who's engaging with your resume and what they've seen, so that way you're not going into the interview and saying like, I don't know if you saw this piece, but I did this thing as well. Don't say, well, I've been tracking you online and I've seen that you've looked at this portfolio piece. You don't need to do that, but it does give you an idea of maybe gauges where you're sitting as a candidate and how they're engaging and what they're looking at and what you might need to highlight more because they didn't look at it versus less. So the end, know that we're kind of at time. I know we also have 15 minutes before the next segment. So I guess, Joan, it's up to you if we want to leave a few minutes for people to ask questions or not.
We have plenty of time for questions if anybody has any.
Perfect.
Tiffany wants to know the dog's name.
Oh, Milo. Let me see where he went. Milo. Hold on, he's coming. Milo, up here. You have fans. Come on.
Oh.
This is my monster. He is very unhappy today. All right.
Growling.
He's gonna go sunbathe again.
Thanks for the cameo.
Yeah, he's kind of a jerk. Yeah, any questions? And I also have my, that's my handle for all of my professional social media and my website. Feel free to shoot an email. I do, if people want. I can get very nitty gritty and granular. Trying to do a 40-minute talk with a broad overview doesn't, it stays relatively simple, but I'm happy, especially as people are navigating jobs, to do one-on-one consultations and really dig through your resume and get that, really see how a fresh user looks through. But if you don't want to do that, let's answer all the questions now. Do we have any more?
It looks like we don't at the moment. If anyone does, they can email you, I guess.
They sure can.
And thank you so much, Sage, for joining us today. This was really, I'm going to have to go back to my LinkedIn profile and
yes, and everyone, feel free to connect. There's also one last tip that I learned on LinkedIn is there is a feature within your LinkedIn that if you're in a conference, so if we are able to do in person next year, you can set your LinkedIn to turn your geography on, to put your location setting on, and then it will allow you to connect to everyone in the same room with you who's doing the same, so you don't have to manually type in all their names and search. And so when you're doing conferences, this can be a really good and quick way to build up your network and actually make those connections. I mean, you should also follow up with the people so you're not just connecting with 100 strangers in a room. Because I think, those connections are more worthwhile when you actually know the person and engage and learn about their background. But that's a little LinkedIn tip and trick for you if you want to do it, because I didn't know they were trying to socialize it to that degree, and it's kind of fantastic. And,
Very cool. And who knows what's going to happen in a year from now.
Yeah, I mean, right now, I don't think LinkedIn is keeping that on for us all hermiting in our homes, but hopefully next year we will see each other in person.